I remember the taste of mud. Not the clean earth of agri-worlds or the sterile dust of void stations, but the particular flavor of trench mud, a compound of clay, chemical runoff, human waste, decomposing flesh, and the alkaline residue of las fire scoring. It coated my teeth, my tongue, the back of my throat. Even now, decades removed, in this quiet scriptorium where I transcribe supply manifests for the Departamento Munitorum, I sometimes wake with that taste in my mouth, and I have to drink 3 cups of recaf before my hands stop shaking enough to hold a stylus. They called us runners. It was a euphemism, like most imperial terminology, a soft word draped over a brutal function. We were messengers, yes, but the title suggested something almost noble, as if we were athletes competing in games rather than what we actually were. Expendable meat carrying folded parchment through kill zones that would reduce a man to vapor and fragments in the span of a heartbeat. I was 17 when they assigned me to the 408th Siege Infantry, freshly tithed from a Hive city, whose name I was forbidden to speak after certain events. I had scored well on agility assessments and poorly on everything else. This made me ideal runner material. The commissariat liked us young, quick, and too stupid to understand the mathematics of our survival. The trench system on Vorath's Bend stretched for 800 kilometers, a zigzagging scar across the planet's ash-gray face. I never saw more than 3 kilometers of it. My world became the communication trench between battalion command and the forward positions, specifically between Major Kellick's dugout and the firing line where Captain Horvath's 3rd Company held a section of front designated Grid Sigma 9. The distance was approximately 420 meters. I ran it 60 to 70 times per day when the fighting was active. Each run took anywhere from 45 seconds to 3 minutes, depending on conditions. Conditions varied. The first week, I thought I might survive. The previous runner, a boy named Tace, had lasted 6 months before a sniper's round took the top of his head off cleanly, like opening a can with a precision blade. 6 months seemed an eternity. The veterans, those who'd been on Vorath's Bend for a full season, spoke of Tace with something approaching reverence. He'd been lucky, they said. Quick, smart about his movements. I studied how they described him, trying to extract principles I could apply. Stay low, vary your rhythm. Never use the same route twice in succession. Count the enemy's firing patterns. Pray to the Emperor, but don't expect him to notice something as small as you. The trenches themselves were a study in engineered misery. 3 meters deep where they were properly maintained, shallower where artillery had collapsed the walls. Duck boards lined the bottom, theoretically keeping us above the water level, but the boards were rotted through in places, and you learned quickly which sections would hold your weight and which would plunge your leg knee deep into freezing, contaminated water that left your skin covered in sores. The walls were shored with corrugated metal and sandbags, but the enemy's guns had been pounding our lines for months before I arrived, and whole stretches had eroded into mere grooves in the earth, offering minimal protection. The smell was the second thing I remember most clearly, after the taste. Trench funk, they called it, though that term barely captured the olfactory assault. It was layered the bottom note of human bodies, unwashed for weeks, overlaid with the copper tang of blood both fresh and dried, the sweet rot of corpses buried in the walls or floating in the sump pools, the acrid bite of propellant and ozone from las fire, the chemical stink of the disinfectant they poured into the latrines, and underneath it all, a smell like burnt hair and sulfur that came from the direction of the enemy lines. Sometimes the wind shifted and you'd catch something worse, a smell that made your hindbrain scream warnings about spoiled meat and diseased spaces. We were told never to speak about that smell. My first run was at dawn on the 3rd day. Major Kellick handed me a sealed dispatch tube, brass inscribed with priority codes, and told me Captain Horvath needed it, immediately if not sooner. The Major's dugout was 8 meters below ground level, reinforced with scavenged ship plate and relatively safe. You accessed the communication trench through a narrow tunnel that required you to move bent, nearly double for 5 meters, before emerging into the trench proper. I remember my hands were sweating despite the cold as I clutched the dispatch tube. The corporal who managed the dugout entrance, A scarred woman named Vess looked at me with the expression you might give a man walking to his execution. "Keep your head down, runner," she said. "Don't stop moving. If you fall, leave whatever you're carrying and crawl. They've got a heavy bolter sighted on the junction near Sigma 7. Goes active every 6 to 8 minutes. Count it out." I nodded, though I didn't really understand. Then I was moving and understanding became irrelevant. The communication trench ran in a zigzag pattern designed to prevent enfilading fire. If an enemy position could see down the trench's length, they could kill dozens with a single sustained burst. The angles forced me to turn sharply every 8 to 10 meters, and each turn was a gamble because you couldn't see what waited around it until you committed to the movement. The trench floor squelched under my boots. The morning air was cold enough to burn my lungs, thick with mist that hadn't yet burned off. I could hear the crack and zip of small arms fire, distant enough to seem almost theoretical. The walls rose on either side of me, narrowing my world to a corridor of pitted metal and crumbling earth. I ran, not sprinting. You learned quickly that sprinting burned energy you'd need for the return trip, but a steady, loping pace that ate ground without exhausting you. 30 meters. 50. The trench junction at Sigma 7 approached. I could see where the communication trench intersected with the firing trench, a T-junction where a sandbagged position offered nominal cover. 2 soldiers manned it, their backs to me, las rifles trained on the parapet. One of them turned as I approached, registering my presence with barely a glance. Then the air came apart. I heard it before I understood it, a sound like canvas tearing, but vast, immense, and then the world was noise and pressure and flying dirt. The heavy bolter opened up, exactly as Corporal Vess had warned, and the junction exploded into chaos. Mass, reactive rounds chewed through sandbags like a beast with metal teeth, detonating in sequence, each explosion overlapping the last. The 2 soldiers at the junction ceased to exist as discrete entities. One moment they were there, the next they were constituent components scattered across 5 meters of trench. Blood painted the walls, steaming in the cold air. I was already moving, some animal instinct overriding conscious thought. I hit the duck, boards at the junction and slid, momentum carrying me through the kill zone as rounds chewed the space I'd occupied a heartbeat before. Something hot scored across my shoulder, shrapnel or bullet fragment, I never knew, and then I was around the corner, into the firing trench proper, my breath coming in ragged gasps and my ears ringing so badly I couldn't hear my own footfalls. The firing trench was more crowded. Soldiers pressed against the parapet, las rifles poking through firing slits or over the top during lulls in enemy fire. They didn't look at me. Their attention was fixed forward, toward an enemy I couldn't see but could feel, a malevolent presence beyond the broken ground of no man's land. I pushed past them, heading for the dugout that housed Captain Horvath's command post. It was another 40 meters, each meter stretching into eternity, because the firing trench was narrower than the communication trench, and I had to squeeze past bodies and equipment. Captain Horvath's dugout was barely worthy of the name, a reinforced shell, scrape covered with corrugated metal and sandbags, carved into the trench wall. I half fell down the steps, my legs suddenly weak, and found myself in a space lit by a single lumen strip, barely 2 meters square. Horvath was bent over a slate, studying grid coordinates. He didn't look up. "Dispatch from Major Kellick, sir." I managed, my voice sounding distant and strange. He took the tube without comment, broke the seal, extracted the parchment inside, read it in silence. His face lean weathered, with the particular tightness around the eyes that came from too long in the trenches, revealed nothing. After 30 seconds, he looked at me properly for the first time. "You're the new runner." "Yes, sir." "You came through the junction at Sigma 7. "Yes, sir." "That position's been hit. I'll need to redeploy fire teams to cover it. Tell the Major I require another platoon to reinforce the line here, and that ammunition is at 30%. We can hold for another 8 hours, maybe 12 if they don't push hard." He paused, studying me with an expression I couldn't read. "Can you remember that?" "Yes, sir." He didn't write it down. Committing orders to physical form that could be captured was forbidden unless absolutely necessary. Everything went through runners, stored in our heads, making us living dispatch tubes. I repeated his words back to him exactly. He nodded. Stay left at Sigma 7. The firing arc for that heavy bolter favors the right side of the junction. I went. The return trip should have been easier. I knew what to expect, knew where the danger waited. Instead, it was worse. The bodies at Sigma 7 were still there, still leaking, and I had to step over them. One of them had been someone I'd seen in the mess the previous night, complaining about the quality of the corpse, starch rations. Now he was meat in a uniform, and I was climbing over him while trying not to look at where his face had been. The heavy bolter didn't fire. I took the left side of the junction as Horvath had advised, pressed so close to the wall that the corrugated metal scraped through my uniform to the skin beneath. I made it back to Major Kellick's dugout in one piece and delivered Horvath's message verbatim. Kellick grunted acknowledgement and immediately began giving me new orders to carry back, a complex set of grid coordinates and firing solutions that took 3 repetitions before he was satisfied I had them exact. Then I was running again. This became the pattern: run forward, deliver message, receive new message, run back, repeat, repeat, repeat until the messages blurred together and the trench became a single continuous space that I navigated in a state approaching fugue. Time lost meaning. There was only the next run, the next message, the next moment of exposure in the killing ground. By the 4th day, I'd learned the rhythm of the enemy guns. The heavy bolter at Sigma 7 fired in 6-minute intervals, give or take 30 seconds. Sniper fire was heaviest at dawn and dusk. Artillery barrages followed a pattern that the veterans had mapped across weeks, every 2 hours, concentrated on rear positions, designed to interdict supply lines. Mortar fire was more random, but tended to target communication trenches after observers spotted movement. You could sometimes predict it by watching for the flash of reflection off optical equipment in the enemy positions, though that required exposing yourself above the parapet, and no one survived long doing that regularly. I learned other lessons too. I learned that the human body contains approximately 5 liters of blood, and that it looks like much more when spread across trench walls. I learned that severed limbs don't always stop moving immediately. The muscles continue firing for seconds after separation, producing twitches that looked almost purposeful. I learned that you could identify explosive types by sound: the crack of frag grenades, the heavier crump of cracked charges, the distinctive double thump of mortar rounds, the shriek scream of artillery shells. I learned that some wounds smelled sweet, others like copper, others like nothing at all. I learned that the worst sound in the trenches wasn't incoming fire. It was the crying. Men wept in the dugouts at night, quietly, their faces turned to the wall. The sound carried through the thin spaces, and you couldn't escape it. Some cried for home, for mothers and lovers and children they'd left behind. Others cried without words, animal sounds of grief and fear and exhaustion. The veterans didn't mock them. Everyone understood that the breaking point was individual and inevitable. It was only a question of when, not if. By the end of the first week, I'd seen 3 other runners die. One took a direct hit from a mortar round and simply ceased to exist in any meaningful form. There wasn't enough left to recover for proper rites. Another bled out from a shrapnel wound to the femoral artery, dying in the mud while a medic worked frantically to clamp the vessel and failing. The third vanished. He went out on a run to a forward observation post and never returned. We heard sporadic small arms fire in that sector, and then nothing. No body was ever recovered. The commissariat recorded him as lost in action, a designation that covered everything from desertion to capture to simple dissolution. I should have been terrified. I was terrified. But terror has a ceiling, a maximum threshold beyond which it stops escalating and becomes something else, a baseline state, white noise in your nervous system. You can't maintain peak fear for 18 hours a day. The body won't allow it. Instead, fear becomes your default setting, and you operate through it, making decisions and taking actions while feeling fundamentally certain you're about to die. The second week, the weather changed. Rain came, not the clean rain of water, worlds but acidic precipitation that burned exposed skin and turned the trenches into rivers of contaminated sludge. The duck boards became treacherous, slick with a combination of water, mud, and chemical runoff. Twice I fell while running, going down hard on the boards, the dispatch tubes I carried skittering away across the trench floor. Both times I scrambled after them on hands and knees, conscious that every second of delay increased the chance of incoming fire, catching me immobile. The rain brought other problems. The trench walls began collapsing in sections, requiring constant repair work that pulled soldiers from the line. Fungal infections spread through the regiment, trench foot, trench mouth, strange rashes that appeared on skin that stayed too long in wet conditions. The medici were overwhelmed. Men continued fighting with infected wounds because there was no choice, no relief rotation, nowhere to go except forward or back, and neither direction offered salvation. During this period, I ran between 30 and 40 messages per day. The pace increased as enemy activity escalated. They were preparing something, everyone could sense it, a gathering pressure like weather before a storm. Patrols reported increased movement in enemy trenches. Artillery spotters called in concentrations of armor in rear areas. The Vox traffic carried that particular tension that preceded major offensive actions. Major Kellick's face grew tighter, more drawn. He slept in his dugout perhaps 3 hours per night, the rest of his time spent coordinating with regiment and division, trying to extract resources, ammunition, reinforcements, medical supplies, from a logistics system stretched past breaking across 50 active fronts on Vorath's Bend. Captain Horvath, when I saw him, had developed a tremor in his left hand that he tried to hide. Other officers began drinking heavily from personal liquor stocks, though this was officially forbidden. The commissariat made examples of 2 lieutenants, executing them in the communication trench for dereliction of duty. Their bodies stayed where they fell for a full day, object lessons in the price of weakness. I ran past those bodies 14 times before they were finally removed. The first few times, I looked at their faces. After that, I stopped looking. They became features of the landscape, no different from the sandbags or the coils of wire. It was during the 3rd week that I began to change in ways I didn't fully recognize at the time. My body adapted to the constant motion, the irregular meals, the interrupted sleep. I became leaner, harder, my movements more economical. But the deeper changes were internal, cognitive. I stopped thinking of myself as a person with a future. The concept of after the war became literally unimaginable. My mind couldn't construct scenarios that extended beyond the immediate tactical situation. I existed in an eternal present tense where the only certainties were the next run, the next message, the next moment of survival. Language changed too. I stopped using names for the dead. They became the body in Sigma 7 or the casualties from 3rd Platoon. Dehumanizing language, yes, but necessary. Names carried weight, implied relationships, suggested these had been people you knew. Better to think of them as objects, removed and distant, because the alternative was to carry them all in your head, and there wasn't room for that burden. The veterans understood this. They'd made the same transition, though at different speeds. I could see it in how they moved through the trenches, efficient, mechanical, their faces neutral even during bombardments. They'd burned out the parts of themselves that felt things like fear or hope or disgust, leaving only the operational core, the minimum necessary to function. I was becoming like them, and I didn't resist the transformation because resistance meant feeling, and feeling meant breaking. On the 19th day, I was caught in the open during an artillery barrage. I'd been running a priority message, one of the red, sealed tubes that indicated time, critical intelligence, from Major Kellick to Captain Horvath. The all-clear signal had sounded 90 seconds before, indicating the regular bombardment window had passed. This should have been safe. It wasn't. The shells came without warning, a sudden scream of incoming fire that gave perhaps 3 seconds of notice. I was 50 meters from any substantial cover, in an exposed section of communication trench, where previous shelling had collapsed the walls to barely waist height. The first shell impacted 30 meters ahead of me, throwing up a geyser of earth and shrapnel. The second hit 20 meters behind. They were bracketing, walking the fire, adjusting. The third would land directly on me. I don't remember making the decision to move. I was simply moving, running full out, no longer caring about energy conservation or tactical awareness. The world contracted to a tunnel of pure motion, my legs pumping, my breath burning in my chest. The scream of the third shell grew louder, became everything, a sound that filled reality. I threw myself forward, diving for a shell crater 5 meters ahead, an old impact site that had been partially incorporated into the trench line. I hit the mud and rolled, momentum carrying me down the crater's slope, and then the shell struck exactly where I'd been standing a heartbeat before. The explosion was beyond sound. It was pressure, a physical force that compressed my internal organs and drove the air from my lungs. The world went white, then red, then dark. I was buried in falling earth, my mouth and nose clogged with mud, my body twisted at angles that sent lightning bolts of pain through multiple joints. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. The weight of the earth pressed down, immense and suffocating. Panic hit then, pure and primal, the drowning terror of burial alive. I thrashed, clawing at the mud, fighting with the last oxygen in my lungs. My fingers found open air. I pulled, heaved, dragged myself upward through soil that wanted to keep me. My head broke surface and I gasped, sucking in air thick with dust and chemical smoke. The barrage was ongoing. Shells landed in sequence, methodical, walking up and down the trench line. Each impact sent tremors through the earth. I could feel them through my entire body, a rhythmic pounding like the heartbeat of some vast, malevolent entity. I stayed in the crater, pressed against the bottom, arms covering my head, and waited for it to end. It lasted 17 minutes. I know because I counted, keeping time by the intervals between impacts, a method of maintaining sanity when external reality became unbearable. 17 minutes of continuous shelling. By the end, I couldn't hear properly. My ears were ringing at a frequency that drowned out normal sound. Blood ran from my nose, though I couldn't tell if it was from blast pressure or the impact of hitting the crater floor. When silence finally came, it was shocking in its completeness. The guns had stopped. The trench line was smoke and settling dust. I climbed out of the crater slowly, testing limbs for serious damage. Bruises, certainly. Possibly cracked ribs on my left side, but nothing that would prevent movement. The dispatch tube was gone. I'd lost it in the dive, or it had been buried, or it had been blown to fragments. I never knew. This was a capital offense. Losing dispatches meant court-martial, meant execution if the commissariat decided to make an example. I stood in the ruined trench, covered in mud, bleeding, and tried to remember the exact wording of the message I'd been carrying. I could recall perhaps 70% of it. Grid coordinates for artillery support, ammunition requirements, something about enemy movement patterns. The specifics were fragmentary, shattered by the concussion of blast and the adrenaline dump of near death. I had two choices: return to Major Kellick and report the loss, accepting the consequences, or continue forward and deliver what I remembered, hoping the partial information was better than nothing. I continued forward. Captain Horvath was in his dugout, bent over maps with 2 other officers. They looked up as I half fell down the steps, taking in my appearance, the mud coating, the blood, the shaking hands. I delivered what I remembered of the message, trying to maintain the proper formal language, aware that I was probably leaving out crucial details. Horvath listened without interruption. When I finished, he nodded slowly. The artillery coordinates are the critical piece. The rest I can infer from context. He paused, studying me. You lost the dispatch tube. It wasn't a question. Yes, sir. Artillery barrage caught me in open ground. I was buried in a crater. But you continued the run. Yes, sir. Something shifted in his expression, not quite approval, but a recognition of something. Get back to Major Kellick. Tell him I received the message and am acting on it. Tell him I need updated intelligence on enemy positions in Subsector 9, Alpha. We're getting movement we can't account for. I made it back to the Major's dugout, delivered Horvath's response, and waited for questions about the missing dispatch tube. They never came. Kellick simply nodded and sent me out again with new orders, and I understood that in the economy of the trenches, results mattered more than procedure. I delivered the critical information. The method was irrelevant, but something had broken in me during those 17 minutes buried in mud, listening to the earth scream. I'd crossed a threshold, passed through some barrier that separated before from after. I could feel it in how my body moved, looser, less controlled, as if the tendons and ligaments had stretched beyond their design specifications. My hands shook constantly now, a fine tremor that never fully stopped, and the taste in my mouth had changed. The mud flavor was still there, but underneath it was something metallic and bitter, like blood or spent ammunition, and no amount of water could wash it away. The fourth week began with a new horror: chemical weapons. The enemy deployed them at dawn, releasing canisters that vented yellow, green clouds across no man's land. The wind was blowing toward our lines. The gas rolled forward with a terrible inevitability, a visible wall of death that moved at walking speed, pooling in shell craters and trench systems, heavier than air, sinking to the lowest points where men sheltered. The alarm sounded, a klaxon that echoed across the sector, and everyone scrambled for rebreather masks. These were crude devices, rubberized face pieces connected to filters that theoretically scrubbed the air of contaminants. In practice, they worked perhaps 60% of the time. The filters clogged quickly. The seals didn't always hold. And there weren't enough masks for everyone, the supply situation being what it was, which meant officers and specialists were prioritized, and ordinary infantry made do with whatever was available. I was fortunate. Runners were considered specialists, and I received a functional mask that fit reasonably well. But I had to keep running through the gas, delivering messages to units all along the line, and the mask made breathing difficult. Each breath required conscious effort, pulling air through filters that offered significant resistance. After 50 meters of running, my lungs burned. After 100, I was dizzy from hypoxia. The gas changed how the war sounded. With the mask on, everything was muffled, distant. Explosions became dull thuds. Shouted orders turned into incomprehensible murmurs. The loudest sound was my own breathing, a rasping, mechanical rhythm that dominated my awareness. I moved through a world wrapped in cotton, disconnected from reality, navigating by memory and the vague shapes visible through the mask's lenses. Men died in the gas. Those without masks, or with faulty equipment, went down quickly. The chemical attacked the lungs and mucous membranes, causing them to flood with fluid, drowning on dry land essentially. I ran past casualties, men on their knees coughing blood, tinged foam, their faces purple, black with asphyxiation. There was nothing to be done for them. The Medicare couldn't operate in the gas without exposing themselves, and even if they could, the damage was usually irreversible. The gas persisted for 6 hours before dissipating enough to remove masks safely. By then, Third Company had lost 18 men to chemical exposure, with another 23 incapacitated and requiring medical evacuation that would never come because the evacuation routes were under fire and there were no transport vehicles available anyway. The dead were left where they fell, and the incapacitated were moved to a dugout where they could die with minimal disruption to operations. I delivered the casualty reports to Major Kellick. He received them without visible reaction, adding the numbers to his running tally of losses. Calculating the degradation of combat effectiveness, we were at 62% of authorized strength now, and still no reinforcements had arrived. The Major sent requests up the chain daily, receiving responses that ranged from "resources are allocated as available" to "maintain current positions with existing assets." That night, I couldn't sleep, not because of noise or fear, those were constants, background conditions, but because my hands wouldn't stop shaking. The tremor had worsened throughout the day until I could barely hold a cup of recaf without spilling it. One of the veterans, a corporal named Miggs, noticed and took me aside. "Shell shock," he said. "Nervous system overload. Happens to everyone eventually. Will it stop?" He shrugged. "Sometimes. Or you learn to work through it. Or it gets worse until you can't function. And then the commissariat puts a bolt round through your skull for cowardice in the face of the enemy. There must be treatment." There is. It's called rotation to rear areas and 2 weeks of rest. But we don't get rotations, so you deal with it until you can't. He produced a flask from his coat, took a swallow, offered it to me. I declined. Alcohol made the shaking worse. The 5th week brought the offensive everyone had been anticipating. It began at ZO 400, a rolling artillery barrage that lasted 3 hours and targeted our forward positions with methodical precision. They'd been mapping our trench system for weeks. probably with aerial reconnaissance or long-range observation, and now they put that intelligence to use. Shells landed in sequence, walking through our lines, demolishing dugouts and killing positions, turning the carefully constructed defenses into rubble. I was in Major Kellick's dugout when it started, having just returned from a night run. The ceiling shook with each impact. Dust fell in streams from the reinforced beams. The lumen strips flickered, threatening to fail. Kellick sat at his field desk, Vox bead in his ear, receiving reports from all along the regimental front. His face was stone. At Yo 700, the barrage lifted and the assault began. They came across no man's land in waves, thousands of them, enemy infantry advancing behind armor support. Our artillery responded, cutting into their formation, but they kept coming. Fire lit the morning, a constant crackle, snap of energy discharge. Heavy weapons opened up, autocannons, heavy bolters, missile launchers, chewing through the advancing ranks. And still they came. I ran constantly during the assault, carrying orders, ammunition requests, casualty reports, target coordinates. The communication trench was a chaos of movement, wounded being dragged back, ammunition carriers pushing forward, officers shouting into Vox units, soldiers repositioning to reinforce failing sectors. The noise was beyond description, a continuous roar of weapons fire and explosions and humans screaming. The first wave broke on our lines and shattered. The second wave pressed closer. The third wave reached the wire, got hung up, was cut down in place, but the fourth wave made it to the trenches, and then it became close combat, knives, entrenching tools, improvised clubs, anything that could kill at arm's length. I witnessed this while carrying a message to a forward position. Men locked together in mud and blood, grappling, stabbing, gouging. The noise changed character, less mechanical, more organic. Grunts of effort, screams of pain, the wet sounds of blades entering flesh. It lasted perhaps 4 minutes before our forces pushed them back. But in that time I saw things I don't have adequate language to describe. Afterward, the trenches were carpeted with bodies, ours and theirs, intermingled, impossible to separate in places. The smell of blood was overwhelming, coating the back of my throat even through the lingering chemical taint from the previous gas attack. Soldiers moved among the corpses, checking for wounded, retrieving ammunition and equipment, the mechanical actions of men too exhausted for emotion. I made 17 runs during the assault, covering over 7 kilometers total, most of it at speeds that should have been impossible given the conditions. Adrenaline, I suppose, or the Emperor's grace, or simple animal refusal to die. I don't know. By the time the enemy withdrew, a tactical retreat to consolidate for another push, I could barely stand. My legs were cramping, my lungs burning, my vision narrowing to a tunnel. Captain Horvath found me collapsed against a trench wall, struggling to remember what message I was supposed to deliver. He took my shoulders, held my gaze with his own. Runner. Focus. What's the message? I couldn't form words. My mouth worked, but nothing emerged except ragged breathing. It's all right, he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. You've done enough. Rest now. But there was no rest. Within an hour, Major Kellick was sending me out again, because 2 other runners had been killed during the assault, and there was no one else to carry the flood of messages required to coordinate our decimated forces. The offensive lasted 4 days. 4 days of continuous combat, broken only by brief lulls when the enemy pulled back to reorganize. We held the line because we had no choice. Because retreat was death and surrender was worse than death. Because the commissariat shot anyone who faltered and the god, Emperor, demanded our service regardless of cost. By the end, 3rd Company had ceased to exist as an effective fighting unit. Captain Horvath was dead, killed by a sniper on the 3rd day. Major Kellick had been wounded. Shrapnel to the leg and arm, serious but not immediately fatal, but continued commanding from his dugout because there was no one to replace him. The 408th Siege Infantry, at full strength a division of 15,000 men, was now at perhaps 38% combat effectiveness, and still no reinforcements came. I learned later that we were a holding action, a deliberate sacrifice. High Command had written off our sector, deciding that our destruction would fix enemy forces in place while the main offensive developed 300 kilometers to the south. We were bait. Expendable. Our deaths purchase time for other men to win glories we would never witness. This is the truth of the Imperium's wars. There are no heroes in the trenches, only the dead and the soon to be dead. The stories they tell in the columns of noble sacrifice and glorious victory are lies designed to keep the tithes flowing and the regiments filled. The reality is mud and blood and endless, grinding attrition, where the only victory is surviving another hour, and the only glory is dying in a way that doesn't completely disgrace your regiment. During the 6th week, something broke in my mind, not dramatically, not a sudden collapse, but a slow dissolution, like salt in water. I began having trouble distinguishing between runs. They blurred together into a single continuous experience, a fugue state where I was always running, always carrying messages I couldn't quite remember. Through trenches that repeated with unsettling similarity, time became non-linear. I would find myself at a destination without memory of the journey. I would deliver messages I didn't recall receiving. Conversations happened that I participated in, but couldn't later reconstruct. My body continued functioning, running, navigating, avoiding fire, while my consciousness drifted, disconnected, observing from a distance. The other soldiers noticed. I could see it in how they looked at me, a mixture of concern and recognition. I was becoming what they called trench mad, a common enough condition among men who'd been under fire too long. Usually it preceded either death or complete breakdown. I was still functional, still completing runs, so no one intervened. Functional was all that mattered. I began seeing things that weren't there, shadows in the trenches that moved against the light, faces in the mud walls that watched me pass, sounds, whispers, laughter, crying, that had no source. I knew these were hallucinations, products of exhaustion and trauma, and the brain's desperate attempt to process incomprehensible input. Knowing didn't make them less real. The worst were the corpses. The dead stayed dead, of course, but in my peripheral vision they would sometimes move. A hand flexing, a head turning, and when I looked directly they were still. This happened dozens of times per day. I stopped reacting to it, stopped looking, accepted that the boundary between living and dead had become permeable in my perception. There was beauty in the dissolution. A strange, terrible beauty. When you stop caring about survival, when you accept death as imminent and inevitable, fear evaporates. What remains is a kind of clarity, a hyper-awareness of the present moment. I could see individual mud particles in the trench walls, could track the ballistic arc of shrapnel with preternatural precision, could feel the concussion of artillery shells as changes in air pressure against my skin seconds. Before the sound reached me, I became very good at my job. The best runner in the regiment, according to Major Kellick, though by then there were only 2 of us left. My routes became optimized, my timing perfect, my movements unconscious and efficient. I stopped thinking about what I was doing and simply did it, my body executing actions before my mind registered the need. This is how you survive the trenches. You become something other than human. You shed the parts of yourself that make you vulnerable, emotion, hope, the belief that you matter, and what remains is a biological machine optimized for a single function. I was a messenger. That was all. That was everything. The 7th week brought winter. Temperatures dropped below freezing, and the mud hardened into uneven concrete. The water in the bottom of the trenches formed ice that had to be broken each morning. Men's breath plumed white in the air, visible targets for enemy snipers. Frostbite became epidemic. I watched soldiers lose fingers and toes to cold, the flesh turning black, dead tissue that the Medicae removed with pruning shears when supplies of actual surgical equipment ran out. The cold changed combat patterns. Everything became slower, more deliberate. Weapons jammed in the frigid temperatures. Las packs lost charge faster. Human bodies moved sluggishly, muscles stiff and unresponsive. The enemy seemed to be experiencing similar difficulties because their attacks decreased in frequency and intensity. This should have been a relief. It wasn't. The cold was its own enemy, as lethal as bullets. Men died in their sleep, hypothermia shutting down their systems quietly, and we'd find them in the morning frozen in their bedrolls. Others died while on watch, sitting at their posts with rifles in hand, turned to ice statues we had to chip free from the trench walls. I kept running. The movement generated heat. the only warmth I felt. Between runs, I would huddle in Major Kellick's dugout near the small thermal unit he'd requisitioned from somewhere, shaking uncontrollably until it was time to move again. The shaking was no longer just nervous system damage, it was my body's attempt to generate heat through muscle movement. Food became scarce. The supply lines were frozen, literally and figuratively. Trucks couldn't navigate the ice. Pack animals died of cold and exhaustion. Aerial resupply was diverted to sectors command considered more critical. We subsisted on corpse, starch rations so old they'd fossilized into chalky blocks that had to be broken with hammers and dissolved in boiling water to be remotely edible. I lost weight I didn't have to lose. My uniform hung on me like draped canvas. My face, when I caught my reflection in ice puddles, looked skull-like, skin stretched tight over bone, eyes sunken deep into sockets. I looked like the corpses I stepped over daily. The distinction between us was merely temporal. The 8th week was when I died, or when I should have died. The details are confused in my memory, fragmented like broken glass. I was running a message to where, I don't recall, through a section of trench that had been hit repeatedly by artillery. The walls were collapsed in places, offering minimal cover. It was mid-afternoon, the weak winter sun providing no warmth, but excellent visibility for snipers. I was moving at my standard pace, not thinking. Just executing the route I'd run 1,000 times before. Then something hit me in the chest with enormous force, spinning me, slamming me against the trench wall. I went down hard, my legs folding, unable to understand what had happened. There was no pain initially, just confusion and the sensation of wetness spreading across my torso. I looked down and saw blood, a remarkable amount of it, soaking through my uniform. A sniper's round had caught me, not center mass, which would have killed instantly, but off to the left side, penetrating between ribs, possibly puncturing lung tissue. I tried to stand and couldn't. My legs weren't responding properly. Blood was bubbling from the wound, and I realized with distant curiosity that I was probably dying. This should have been terrifying. Instead, I felt almost peaceful. The running was over. The messages were over. The endless, grinding horror of survival was over. I don't know how long I lay there. Minutes or hours, time had stopped meaning anything. The cold helped, slowing my circulatory system, reducing blood loss. Or perhaps I was already dead and simply didn't realize it yet. Someone found me. I remember being dragged, the rough handling of evacuation, the narrow tunnel leading to a medical station. I remember the stink of disinfectant and blood, the distant screaming of other wounded, the feeling of hands working on my chest. Then nothing. I woke in a field hospital 3 days later, 40 kilometers behind the lines. The wound had been sealed with synthetic tissue and antibiotics had been dumped into my system to combat infection. I was alive, though the medici who told me this seemed almost apologetic about it. "You're extremely fortunate," he said. "The round missed your heart by perhaps 2 centimeters, clean through and through, no major vessels severed. You'll recover fully. When can I return to my unit?" The question was automatic, programmed. He stared at me like I'd asked something obscene. "Return. Son, you're being rotated out. Your service in forward positions is complete. You'll be reassigned to rear echelon duties once you've healed." I didn't believe him. It was a trick, or a misunderstanding, or a cruel joke. Rotation out didn't happen. You fought until you died or went mad, and then you were replaced. Those were the only options. But it was true. My medical records showed 9 weeks in continuous forward combat as a trench runner, a statistical impossibility, apparently. Most runners lasted days or weeks at most. I'd lasted over 2 months, completing an estimated 4,000 individual runs under fire, a regimental record. This, combined with my wound, qualified me for rear assignment under some obscure provision of Departamento Munitorum regulations. I spent 6 weeks in recovery, my body healing while my mind struggled to process the concept of safety. The field hospital was only nominally safer than the trenches. It was still within artillery range, still subject to occasional shelling, but compared to constant exposure, it might as well have been paradise. I slept in an actual bed, ate hot food, wasn't required to run through kill zones, and I couldn't adjust to it. My body remained locked in combat mode. adrenaline spiking at random intervals, hands shaking, jumping at sudden sounds. I couldn't sleep more than 2 hours at a stretch before nightmares woke me. The dreams were always the same, running through trenches that never ended, carrying messages I couldn't remember, while something immense and terrible pursued me. The medicare called it combat fatigue and prescribed rest and routine. But there is no rest for the mind that's seen what I saw, experienced what I experienced. The trenches were in me now, permanent, a landscape I would navigate for the rest of my life. After recovery, I was assigned to a logistics unit in a rear area supply depot, processing inventory and managing warehouse documentation. It was mind-numbing bureaucratic work, the kind of duty I would have considered torture before the trenches. Now it was sanctuary. I had a desk, a roof. No one was shooting at me, but I couldn't escape what I'd become. The taste of mud remained constant in my mouth. My hands still shook. I flinched at loud noises. And I felt a guilt that defied rational explanation, guilt for surviving when so many hadn't. Guilt for accepting the relative comfort of rear assignment, while other men still died in the trenches. I learned later that the 408th Siege Infantry was annihilated 6 weeks after my evacuation. The enemy launched a final massive assault, broke through our lines, and overran the entire sector. Major Kellick died in his dugout, fighting to the last. The few survivors were absorbed into other units. The regiment's colors were retired, added to the long list of formations that existed now only in departmental records and memorial scrolls. I tell myself I was fortunate. I survived. I received honorable service and was granted continued duty in the Emperor's armies. Many trench runners never even received proper burial. Their bodies lost in the mud, dissolved into the same earth they died defending. But survival is its own form of curse. I carry the trenches with me, every hour of every day. I see the dead in crowds of living people. I hear artillery in distant thunder. I taste mud in every meal. And I know, with absolute certainty, that some essential part of me remained in those trenches, buried in the frozen mud of Voroth's Bend, and that I will never be whole again. This is what it means to serve the Imperium. Not glory, not honor, not the noble sacrifice depicted in propaganda. Just endless grinding trauma, and the hollow survival of those few unlucky enough to live through what was meant to kill them. The Departamento Munitorum considers me a success story, a model of effective service and proper devotion to duty. They cite my record in training documents, using my survival as proof that faith in the Emperor and adherence to protocol can overcome any obstacle. They don't mention the shaking hands, the nightmares, the way I sometimes lose track of where I am, believing for terrifying moments that I'm back in the communication trench, running between Kellick's dugout and Horvath's position, carrying messages that matter absolutely and not at all. Sometimes I think about the other runners, Tace, who lasted 6 months and was considered lucky. The 3 I watched die during my first week. The dozens more who came after me and lasted perhaps days before enemy fire or madness claimed them. We were expendable assets, human telegraph systems, alive only because the Imperium's communication technology couldn't function reliably in the electromagnetic chaos of modern warfare. I wonder what they would think, knowing I survived. Would they consider it justice, or cosmic joke, or simple random chance in a universe devoid of meaning? I work my logistics post with mechanical efficiency, processing requisition forms and inventory manifests, a tiny cog in the incomprehensible machinery of imperial warfare. The work is meaningless but essential, another paradox of service. Everything matters, nothing matters. Your individual fate is irrelevant, your collective function is critical. Late at night, in my bunk in the logistics compound, I sometimes allow myself to remember. Not the horror, that's always present, unavoidable, but the strange moments of beauty that existed within it, the way ice crystals formed on trench walls during cold dawns, the camaraderie of shared misery, the pride of completing a difficult run under impossible conditions. These moments don't redeem the experience or make it worthwhile, but they complicate it, add texture to what could otherwise be dismissed as simple brutality. The Imperium runs on such complications. Men must believe their suffering serves purpose, that their deaths mean something, or the entire edifice collapses. So we construct narratives of duty and honor, we speak of emperor and empire, We pretend that individual agony aggregates into collective glory. Maybe it does. Maybe my runs through the trenches, my delivery of those thousands of messages, contributed to some larger victory I'll never understand. Maybe the deaths of my fellow runners purchased something valuable, time, position, intelligence, that altered the course of campaigns. Or maybe we were just meat ground between the millstones of forces too vast to comprehend, and any meaning we extract is self, deception designed to make the horror bearable. I don't know. I'll never know. And in the end, it doesn't matter. Because I'll carry the taste of mud, and the sound of artillery, and the feeling of running through kill zones, until the day I die, and no amount of philosophy or faith can change that fundamental truth. This is my confession. This is my testimony. This is what it meant to be a trench runner in the 408th Siege Infantry on Vorath's Bend, in the Emperor's endless wars, in the grim darkness of the far future. I survived. The Emperor protects. Sometimes I wish he hadn't.